Some bonds are so strong. Even the ground cannot keep them buried. The wind moved softly through the cemetery that night, whispering across rows of aging headstones as if carrying stories no one had listened to in years, and under a sky dimmed by low clouds. Ethan Caldwell stepped carefully along the gravel path, his boots crunching in a slow, measured rhythm that matched the heaviness in his chest, while beside him Rex moved with a different kind of purpose, his ears alert, his body tense, his amber eyes scanning the darkness as if something unseen had called. His name. Ethan had only meant to visit for a moment, just long enough to stand by the small marble marker that bore his wife's name, just long enough to remember without breaking. But Rex had stopped halfway there, his paws planted firmly near a crooked, weather-worn grave off to the side, one Ethan didn't recognize, and no matter how many times he called, the dog refused to move. Rex. Ethan muttered, his voice low, worn thin by years of speaking only when necessary, but the dog didn't respond, instead lowering his head, sniffing the ground with slow, deliberate breaths, then letting out a soft whine that barely rose above the rustle of leaves. The air carried a chill that seeped through Ethan's jacket, the kind that didn't just touch the skin but settled deeper, into memory, into places he had spent years trying to silence. And for a moment he considered pulling the leash, forcing the dog to follow, telling himself it was nothing, just instinct, just an animal reacting to a scent long faded. But something in Rex's posture stopped him, something too focused, too certain to dismiss. The grave itself looked older than the others nearby, the stone tilted slightly, its surface worn smooth by time and weather, the name nearly erased except for a few faint letters that caught the dim light. And as Ethan stepped closer, he felt an odd pressure in his chest, like a memory trying to surface but not yet ready to be seen. Rex pawed gently at the earth, not digging wildly, but testing it, pressing and pulling back as if listening for a response beneath the soil. Then he froze, his ears lifting, his body going still. In a way Ethan had learned long ago to trust more than any alarm. And in that silence, the world seemed to narrow, the wind pausing, the distant hum of the town fading until all that remained was the faint sound of Rex's breathing and the soft shift of gravel under Ethan's boots as he took one step closer. "What is it, boy?" he asked quietly, though he already knew the question wasn't meant for the dog alone. Rex didn't look at him. Not this time, his gaze fixed on the ground as if something beneath it was calling, not loudly, but persistently, like a heartbeat buried deep where no one else could hear it. And slowly, against his better judgment, Ethan crouched down, brushing his gloved hand across the cold surface of the earth, feeling the texture of soil that seemed different, looser than it should have been, as though it had been disturbed not long ago, and a faint metallic scent lingered in the air, subtle but unmistakable, catching in the back of his throat and stirring. Something old, something he hadn't felt since the days when silence meant danger and every vibration carried meaning. Rex let out a low, steady breath, then placed one paw firmly against the ground, pressing down as if marking a point, and when he finally turned his head toward Ethan, his eyes held a clarity that made the man's chest tighten, because it wasn't confusion or fear he saw there, but recognition, the kind that doesn't come from instinct alone, and for the first time that night, Ethan realized this wasn't just a stop along the way. This wasn't a distraction from grief. This was something else entirely, something waiting, something patient, and as the wind picked up again, threading through the trees with a hollow, almost rhythmic whisper, he understood one thing with a certainty he couldn't explain. Rex wasn't refusing to leave. He was refusing to let something stay hidden. The longer Ethan kept his hand against the ground, the more certain he became that something about it was wrong, not in a way that shouted danger, but in a quieter way that unsettled him, like a memory that did not quite fit the story he had told himself for years. And when he pressed his fingers deeper into the soil, the earth gave slightly beneath the pressure, softer than it should have been after weeks without rain, as if it had been turned over recently, and then smoothed back into place with care. Rex shifted his weight, circling once before stopping again at the exact same spot, his movements precise, deliberate, almost rehearsed, and then he let out 3 short barks, evenly spaced. The same pattern Ethan had heard once before in a place far from here, a place filled with dust and broken Concrete where sound had meant everything and silence had meant even more. Ethan pulled his hand back slowly, his breath forming a faint cloud in the cold air, and for a moment he simply listened, not with his ears alone, but with the part of him that had learned to notice what others overlooked. And there it was, faint but steady, a subtle vibration beneath the ground, not strong enough to shake the soil, but present enough to feel if you knew how to look for it, a rhythm that did not belong to wind or passing traffic, something too measured, too consistent. That is not possible, he murmured, though the words sounded hollow even to him. And Rex responded with a low, steady sound in his throat, not fear, not warning, but recognition, as if the dog understood something Ethan had not yet allowed himself to accept. The headstone loomed just above them, its worn letters catching a sliver of moonlight. And this time Ethan leaned closer, brushing away a thin layer of dirt and moss until the name became clearer, not fully intact, but enough to form a shape in his mind, a pattern that tugged at something buried deep within him. And his chest tightened as he traced the faint outline of the letters, his pulse slowing in that strange, focused way it used to before something important revealed itself. He shifted his attention back to the ground and began to clear away the top layer of soil with his hands, moving carefully, methodically, not digging wildly but uncovering, letting the earth fall away in small increments until his fingers brushed against something solid, something that did not belong to the natural texture of dirt and stone. And when he paused, the silence around them seemed to deepen, the wind pulling back just enough to make space for what came next. Rex lowered himself beside the spot, his nose inches from Ethan's hands, his breathing steady but intent. And when Ethan brushed away another layer of soil, the faint edge of metal revealed itself, dull and cold beneath the dirt, a straight line where there should have been none. And the moment his fingers traced along it, that same metallic scent grew stronger, sharper now, carrying with it a familiarity he could not ignore. He sat back slightly, his mind moving faster than his body, piecing together fragments that did not yet form a full picture but pointed in a direction he could no longer deny. And for the first time since he had followed Rex to this forgotten corner of the cemetery, doubt gave way to something else, something quieter but far more certain. This was not an accident, and whatever lay beneath this grave had not been placed there to be forgotten. It had been placed there to wait. And somehow, for reasons he did not yet understand, Rex had known exactly where to find it. Ethan did not move for several seconds after the edge of the metal revealed itself, his hand hovering just above it, as if touching it too quickly might break whatever fragile truth was beginning to surface. And the longer he stared at that straight, unnatural line beneath the soil, the more the world around him seemed to fade into the background, leaving only the quiet rhythm beneath the ground and the steady presence of Rex beside him. The dog shifted closer, lowering his head until his nose nearly touched the exposed metal, then inhaled slowly, deeply, before letting out a soft exhale that carried a strange calm, as if whatever lay hidden there was not a threat, but something waiting to be acknowledged. Ethan swallowed, the dryness in his throat catching as he finally reached forward and brushed more dirt away, his movements careful and deliberate, revealing more of the object inch by inch until the outline became clearer. A rectangular shape, no more than a couple of feet across, with edges too precise to be anything natural. And as his fingers traced along the surface, he felt the faint ridges of manufactured seams, the kind he had seen before in places where things were meant to be sealed, protected, or hidden. The cold metal sent a subtle chill through his glove, and with it came a flicker of memory, not fully formed, but enough to make his chest tighten, a sensation of standing somewhere else, somewhere louder, where the ground had not been quiet, and the air had carried a different kind of weight. He pulled his hand back slightly, taking a slow breath as he glanced toward the headstone again, the partially revealed name pressing harder against his thoughts now, as if the letters were no longer just markings on stone, but a key to something he had locked away long ago. Rex shifted again, this time placing his paw gently on the exposed corner of the metal, not pressing down but resting there, as if claiming it. And when Ethan looked at him, there was no uncertainty in the dog's eyes, only a steady insistence that this was where he needed to focus, that this was the reason they had come here whether Ethan had intended it or not. The wind picked up briefly, moving through the trees with a low, hollow sound that seemed to echo across the cemetery. And for a moment Ethan closed his eyes, letting that sound settle into the silence inside him, measuring it against the faint vibration still present beneath the ground. And when he opened them again, something had shifted, not outside, but within him. A quiet decision forming without the need for words. He leaned forward once more, clearing the remaining dirt along the edges until he uncovered what looked like a small recessed handle, partially buried but intact, its shape unmistakable now. And as his fingers curled around it, he hesitated, not out of fear, but out of recognition, because somewhere deep in his memory, this exact motion had meant the beginning of something that could not be undone. Rex let out a low, steady breath, his body still but attentive, and the ground beneath Ethan's knees felt colder now, more solid, as if whatever lay beneath had been waiting long enough and was no longer content to remain hidden. Ethan tightened his grip on the handle, feeling the weight of the moment settle over him like the still air before a storm. And though he could not yet see what was inside, he understood with a clarity that did not need explanation that this was not just a discovery. It was a connection, one that reached backward through years he had tried to leave behind and forward into something he had not yet begun to understand. And as he prepared to pull, one thought settled quietly in his mind, steady and undeniable. Some things are not lost. They are simply waiting for the right moment to be found. Ethan pulled slowly, not with force but with the careful control of someone who understood that what lay beneath might be fragile in ways that could not be seen. And for a moment the handle resisted as if the earth itself was reluctant to release its hold. Then with a soft shift, almost like a breath exhaled after being held too long, the metal gave way, rising just enough to break the seal that had kept it hidden. A faint sound followed, subtle but unmistakable, the quiet scrape of metal against soil. And as Ethan lifted further, a narrow gap opened along the edge, allowing a thin line of colder air to escape from below, carrying with it that same metallic scent now stronger, clearer, and threaded with something older, something that did not belong to the surface world. Rex leaned in immediately, his nose hovering near the opening, his breathing steady but focused, and when he let out a low, almost inaudible sound, it was not alarm but acknowledgement, as if whatever waited inside was already known to him in a way Ethan could not yet comprehend. The lid was heavier than it first appeared, its weight uneven as if anchored by more than just gravity, and Ethan adjusted his grip, lifting it inch by inch until the opening widened enough for him to see into the darkness below, though at first there was nothing but shadow, a hollow space that seemed to absorb the faint light around it. He paused there, holding the lid partially open, his arms steady despite the tension building in his chest, and for a moment he did not look inside, choosing instead to listen, to feel, to let the silence settle again around them. And in that silence the faint vibration he had noticed earlier seemed to fade, not disappear, but soften, as though whatever had been pulsing beneath the ground had shifted now that the surface had been disturbed. Finally, he leaned forward slightly, allowing his eyes to adjust, and shapes began to form within the darkness, edges and outlines that hinted at something placed deliberately rather than buried by chance. And as the moonlight found its way into the narrow opening, it revealed the corner of a container within the cavity, smaller than the outer casing, positioned with precision, its surface smooth and intact despite the years it must have spent hidden. Ethan felt a slow, steady tightening in his chest, not fear, not exactly, but something closer to recognition, the kind that comes before a memory fully returns, and without thinking he reached one hand inside, his movements cautious, respectful, as if he were crossing into a space that did not belong entirely to him. The air within was colder, carrying a stillness that felt untouched by time, and when his fingers brushed against the inner object, he felt the same ridged texture beneath his glove, confirming what he had already begun to suspect, that this was no ordinary container, that it had been placed here with purpose, sealed and hidden in a way meant to endure. Rex shifted beside him, his body lowering slightly, his head tilting as he watched Ethan's hand disappear into the opening. And then he let out a soft breath, almost like a sigh, the kind of sound that comes when something long awaited is finally within reach. Ethan paused again, his hand resting against the object inside, his thoughts moving through fragments that refused to settle into a clear picture. And as he sat there between the open ground and the quiet sky, he understood that whatever lay beneath this grave was not just a secret. It was a message, one that had been waiting in silence for someone who could finally hear it. And as his fingers tightened slightly around the edge of the inner container, one realization settled into him with quiet certainty. This moment had not been an accident, and neither had the path that led him here. Ethan tightened his grip around the inner container and slowly began to lift it from its resting place. The movement deliberate and controlled as loose soil shifted softly around the edges, falling back into the hollow space with a muted sound that seemed louder than it should have been in the stillness of the night. And as the object emerged fully into the open air, the moonlight revealed its surface more clearly, a compact metal case, weathered but intact, its corners reinforced, and its seams sealed with the kind of precision that spoke of intention rather than chance. For a moment, he simply held it there, suspended between the open ground and the quiet sky, feeling its weight in his hands, not heavy in a physical sense, but carrying something else, something unseen yet undeniable. And beside him Rex rose slightly, his posture alert but calm, his gaze fixed not on Ethan but on the case itself, as if confirming that what had been hidden was now exactly where it needed to be. The wind moved again, brushing lightly across Ethan's face, carrying the faint scent of pine and cold earth, but beneath it lingered that same metallic trace, sharper now, more defined. And as he lowered the case onto the ground beside the open grave, a subtle realization began to form, not fully shaped but impossible to ignore, that this object had not only been hidden, it had been preserved, protected against time and weather as if its contents were meant to survive until this very moment. He ran his fingers slowly across the surface, brushing away the thin layer of dirt that clung to it, revealing faint markings etched into the metal, not decorative, but functional, a series of lines and symbols worn by time, yet still visible enough to suggest a purpose. And as his eyes followed those markings, a flicker of recognition stirred again, stronger now, closer to the surface, like a name he almost remembered but could not yet speak. Rex stepped closer, his nose hovering inches above the case. Then he sat back on his haunches, his tail still, his ears forward, watching with a patience that felt almost human, as though he understood that whatever came next required stillness rather than action. Ethan exhaled slowly, steadying himself, and reached for the latch, his fingers hesitating just before contact, not out of fear, but out of respect for the moment unfolding in front of him, because somewhere deep within, he knew that opening this case would not simply reveal an object. It would reveal a connection, something that reached beyond this place and into a part of his life he had not revisited in years. The silence around them deepened again, the distant world fading into nothing more than a memory. And for a brief second, Ethan closed his eyes, grounding himself in the present, in the feel of the cold air against his skin, in the steady presence of Rex beside him, in the quiet certainty that whatever lay inside this case had been waiting, not for just anyone, but for him. When he opened his eyes again, the hesitation was gone, replaced by a calm resolve that settled into his hands. And as his fingers finally pressed against the latch, he felt the faintest resistance before it gave with a soft, almost inaudible click, a sound so small yet so final that it seemed to echo in the stillness. And in that moment, as the seal broke and the lid loosened beneath his touch, one thought rose clearly through everything else. Some truths do not reveal themselves until we are ready to carry them. The latch released with a quiet finality that seemed to settle into the air around them. And for a moment Ethan did not open the case, his hand resting lightly on the lid, as if feeling for something beyond the surface, something that could not be seen, but could still be understood if he remained still long enough. Rex did not move either, his body steady, his gaze fixed, the faint rise and fall of his breathing the only sign that time had not stopped completely. And in that shared silence, the night seemed to hold its breath with them, waiting. Ethan finally lifted the lid slowly, carefully, allowing it to open just enough for the moonlight to slip inside. And what it revealed was not chaos or clutter, but order, precise and intentional. Every item placed with care, as though someone had known this moment would come, and wanted everything to be exactly where it needed to be. At the top rested a small cloth, folded neatly, its edges worn but clean, and beneath it the faint outline of something metallic caught the light, reflecting a dull, steady glow that felt strangely familiar. Ethan hesitated only a second before reaching in, his fingers brushing the cloth aside, and when he lifted it, the object beneath came into view fully, a set of military dog tags, their surface aged but unmistakable. The chain coiled gently as if it had been placed there by hand rather than dropped. The moment his eyes settled on the engraved letters, something shifted inside him, not a sudden jolt, but a slow, undeniable recognition, like a door opening in a place he had kept closed for too long, and his breath caught slightly as he leaned closer, reading the name again, more carefully this time, as if the letters might change if he looked away. Rex lowered his head beside the case, his nose hovering just above the tags. Then he gave a soft exhale, a quiet acknowledgement that carried no urgency, only confirmation, as though this discovery had been expected all along. Ethan's hand trembled slightly as he lifted the tags from the case, the metal cool against his skin even through the glove, and as they shifted in his grasp, they made a faint, familiar sound, a soft clink that echoed far deeper than the night around him, reaching into memories that had never truly faded, only settled beneath the surface. Beneath the tags lay more items, carefully arranged, a small photograph sealed in a protective sleeve, its edges slightly curled with time, and a folded piece of paper, thicker than ordinary, its creases sharp as if it had been opened and closed many times before being placed here. Ethan did not reach for them yet, his focus still fixed on the tags in his hand, his mind moving through fragments that refused to align completely, flashes of faces, voices, places where the air had been filled with dust and urgency. And somewhere within those fragments, a name that now stood in front of him, no longer distant, no longer uncertain. The wind moved again, softer this time, carrying a low whisper through the trees that felt less like a warning and more like a reminder. And as Ethan stood there with the tags in his hand and the open case at his feet, one truth began to settle quietly into place. Whatever had been buried here was never meant to disappear. It had been waiting to be remembered. Ethan did not realize he had stopped breathing until the cold air forced its way back into his lungs, sharp and grounding, as his eyes remained fixed on the name etched into the metal, a name that no longer belonged to memory alone, but now existed here, in his hands, undeniable and present, and slowly, almost reluctantly, he spoke it under his breath, testing its weight after all these years, letting it settle into the silence around him as if the world itself needed to hear it again. The sound of it stirred something deeper than recognition, something that had been buried alongside it. And as he lowered himself onto one knee, the gravel shifting softly beneath him, the past began to rise not in fragments this time, but in a slow, steady clarity, like fog lifting from a landscape he had once known by heart. Rex moved closer, pressing gently against Ethan's side, not seeking attention but offering presence, his warmth a quiet anchor in the middle of something far larger than either of them could fully understand. And when Ethan finally looked down at the rest of the contents inside the case, his hand moved almost on its own, reaching for the photograph beneath the tags. The plastic sleeve crinkled softly as he lifted it, catching a sliver of moonlight that illuminated the image inside, and for a moment his vision blurred. Not from the darkness, but from the sudden weight of seeing something he had not expected to see again, a younger version of himself standing beside another man, both of them framed by a distant horizon that stretched endlessly behind them, their expressions caught somewhere between exhaustion and quiet determination. Ethan's thumb traced the edge of the photograph, his breath unsteady now, and as he focused on the other face in the image, the lines of memory aligned completely, removing all doubt. Because this was not just a name, not just a forgotten connection. This was someone he had known, someone he had trusted, someone who had once stood beside him when the world had been louder, harsher, and far less forgiving. Rex let out a soft, low sound, almost like a hum, his gaze shifting between Ethan and the photograph as if acknowledging the truth that had now fully revealed itself. And in that moment, the cemetery no longer felt like a place of endings, but something else entirely, a place where something unfinished had been waiting patiently to be completed. Ethan lowered the photograph slightly, his attention drawn now to the folded paper beneath. Its edges worn but carefully preserved, and when he picked it up, he noticed the way it had been folded with precision, not hastily, but intentionally, as though whoever had placed it here had taken the time to ensure it would endure. His fingers paused along the crease, the simple act of opening it carrying a weight that felt heavier than anything he had held that night. And for a brief second, he hesitated again, not out of uncertainty, but because he understood that whatever was written inside would not just explain what had been hidden, it would explain why. The wind moved softly through the trees once more, no longer restless, but almost guiding. And as Ethan finally began to unfold the paper, one realization settled into him with quiet certainty, steady and unshakable. Some connections do not end when we lose sight of them. They simply wait for the moment we are ready to see them again. The paper unfolded slowly beneath Ethan's fingers, each crease releasing with a faint, deliberate sound that seemed far louder in the quiet of the night. And as the final fold opened, the handwriting revealed itself in steady, careful lines, not rushed, not uncertain, but written by someone who had known exactly what they needed to say and had taken the time to say it right. Ethan's eyes moved across the first few words, and almost immediately, the air around him seemed to shift, as if the space itself had narrowed to just this moment, just this message, and the voice behind the ink began to take shape in his mind, not imagined, but remembered. The words spoke plainly, without decoration, yet carried a weight that settled deep, explaining not only the presence of the case but the years that had passed since the name on those tags had last been spoken aloud. And as Ethan continued reading, his grip on the paper tightened slightly, not out of tension but out of something closer to disbelief, because the story written there did not follow the one he had accepted all this time. It spoke of survival where there had been none, of distance where there had been absence, of a path that had continued quietly, deliberately, just out of sight. Rex shifted closer again, lowering himself beside Ethan, his head resting near the open case, his eyes half closed but still attentive, as if he had already heard the message long before it was written down, and now simply waited for Ethan to catch up to what had always been true. The letter spoke of watching from afar, of moments where the distance had felt necessary, not out of separation but out of protection, and with each line, Ethan felt the steady unraveling of something he had believed for years, something that had shaped the way he saw himself and the world around him. And now, piece by piece, it was being replaced with something quieter, but far more solid. There was no bitterness in the words, no regret, only a calm acceptance of the path that had been taken, and an understanding that some things could not be explained in the moment, only revealed when the time was right. Ethan paused halfway through, his eyes lifting from the page as he looked out across the cemetery, the rows of stones stretching into the darkness. And for the first time since he had arrived, the place no longer felt heavy with endings, but filled with something else, something patient, something that had been waiting without urgency. He looked back down at the letter, his breath steady now, and continued reading, the final lines carrying a clarity that left no room for doubt, explaining why the case had been hidden here, why the grave had been marked the way it was, and why Rex, of all beings, had been the one to find it. When he reached the last word, Ethan did not move immediately, the paper still held in his hands, the message settling into him fully, and beside him Rex exhaled softly, as if acknowledging that the truth had finally found its place. The wind moved gently through the trees once more, no longer whispering but almost steady now. And as Ethan folded the letter carefully back along its original lines, one understanding rose quietly above everything else, clear and unshakable. Some stories are not meant to be told all at once. They are meant to be discovered, piece by piece, until the meaning reveals itself exactly when it is needed most. Ethan remained still for a long time after folding the letter, his hands resting quietly over the metal case, as if holding something far more fragile than what could be seen. And the night around him no longer felt cold in the same way. The air softer now, almost settled, as though whatever had been waiting beneath the ground had finally been acknowledged and no longer needed to call out. Rex lowered himself fully beside him, his body relaxed, his head resting gently against Ethan's leg, the steady warmth grounding him in a way that words never could. And for a moment Ethan simply listened to that quiet presence, the slow rhythm of the dog's breathing blending with the faint movement of the wind through the trees, creating a stillness that felt complete rather than empty. He looked down at the open grave, at the space that had once held something hidden and now held something understood, and carefully, with deliberate care, he began to place the items back into the case. First the photograph, then the tags, and finally the folded letter, each movement measured, respectful, as if returning them was not an act of concealment, but one of honoring what they represented. When the lid closed again, the soft click of the latch carried a different meaning than before, no longer the beginning of a discovery, but the completion of it. And as Ethan set the case gently back into the ground, he did not feel the same uncertainty that had filled him earlier, only a quiet clarity that settled deeper with every breath. He gathered the loose soil slowly, covering the case once more, smoothing the surface with his hands until the earth looked undisturbed again, the same way it had when Rex first led him here. But now the stillness felt different, not hiding something unknown, but holding something understood. Rex rose as Ethan stood, stretching briefly before stepping closer, his shoulder brushing lightly against Ethan's side, and together they stood there in the quiet space between the past and the present, the weight of both no longer pulling in different directions, but settling into something balanced, something whole. Ethan turned his gaze back to the headstone one last time, the worn letters no longer incomplete in his mind, the name now clear, connected, no longer distant, but part of a story that had come full circle in a way he had never expected. The wind moved gently once more, carrying a low, steady sound through the trees that no longer felt like a whisper trying to be heard, but like a voice at rest. And as Ethan exhaled slowly, the tightness in his chest eased in a way he had not felt in years, not because the past had changed, but because it had finally been understood. He reached down briefly, resting his hand against Rex's head, the simple gesture carrying more meaning than anything he could have said. And then he stepped back from the grave, not in retreat, but in quiet acceptance, leaving the space as it was meant to be. As they walked away together, the gravel path stretching ahead under the dim light of the sky, Ethan did not look back again, not because he needed to forget, but because he no longer had to search. And somewhere in the quiet of that moment, one truth remained, steady and certain. Sometimes the things we think were lost were never truly gone. They were simply waiting for us to be ready to understand why they stayed.